Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, well, I'll turn it over to Heather to get us started.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this third section of our talk. My name is Heather Hill, and I am a white woman with long purple hair. I wear glasses. I'm going to do a brief land acknowledgement. I'm a settler and an immigrant on the land we currently call Canada. And I'm talking to you today from London, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Chinantan nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the uh, Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I wanted to point out that within London, we have the Thames River, although an Anishinaabeg name is the Deshkanzibi or Antler River because it antlers out throughout the city. Uh, Thinking about water in London is easy. We have fresh, clean water straight out of the tap. But the United Nation of the Thames gets most of its drinking water from the Deshkanzibi, and they're just south of us. And they have been under a boil water advisory for over 5 years now. And it is a travesty, and they're not the only Indigenous community that lacks clean water. Autumn Peltier is an 18-year-old from the Wikwemikong First Nation, and she is the chief water protector for the Anishinaabeg Nation. She works and advocates for clean water across Canada and internationally, and her work was inspired by her great aunt, Elder Josephine Mandman. Josephine walked 25,000 kilometers around the shorelines of the Great Lakes to bring awareness to the need to protect our water from pollution. So it is on settlers, it's on us to learn from Indigenous communities and nations how to be a part of our world in a way that is less extractive, in a way that shows respect, relationship, and reciprocity so that all communities can have clean water. In the words of a friend of mine, thank you for hearing my words, and I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks. So my name is Sarah Smith. I'm associate professor here in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, and I hold the Canada Research Chair in Art, Culture, and Global Relations. I'm a white woman with brown hair, wearing a long black sleeve shirt, and there's a plant in the background behind me. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all here to this series, Conversations on Access. And today we're focusing on visual art and curating, which is going to allow us to talk about access as a methodology, disabled futures, and to probe the limits of institutional critique and social justice. So I established this series in 2023 with Heather and Juan Escobar-Lamana, who you're going to hear more from in a minute. And it's hosted by FIMS here at Western. And the purpose of this series is to foreground access as a tangible, lived experience, going beyond an approach to access solely as a topic of research. So this focus is realized through the selection of our speakers, who include artists, activists, practitioners, as well as scholars. Each of the conversation aims to initiate a broad discussion that engages the public as well as university community. And so we employ the conversational format for these events to encourage connections, critical reflections, and discussion that supports care and the building of community, and one that aims to inform our approach here in London, as well as our actions here at Western University. So our first conversation featured Felissa Thompson and Dr. Sammy Schock addressing Black disability activism. And our second conversation featured Dr. Jonathan Stern and Ashton Forrest on impairment theory and disability activism. And so what we're going to do is shortly share links in the chat to the recordings of both of those events in case you want to catch up on those conversations. Of course, we would not be here without support. We would like to acknowledge the support of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, as well as the Canada Research Chairs Program. And I'd like to extend thanks as well to many people in the FIMS community, including Dean Lisa Henderson for her support of the series, and Matt Ward for his help with the Zoom webinar, and Becky Blue, who has worked tirelessly to help us organize and communicate and promote this event. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Juan Escobar-Lamana.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Escobar-Lamana. I'm a white man with short, curly brown hair. I'm wearing a brown long sleeve shirt. And today we are thrilled to introduce our two panelists. Joining us are Amanda Cachia and Syrus Marcus Ware. For a bit of an introduction for the two of them, Amanda is a curator, consultant, writer, and art historian who specializes in disability art activism across intersectional axes of difference, including gender, race, and sexuality. She is the tenure-track assistant professor and assistant director of the Master of Arts in Art Leadership graduate program at the Catherine G. McGovern College of the Arts at the University of Houston, where she also serves as the coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Museum and Gallery Management and the Graduate Certificate in Arts and Health. She's the author of The Agency of Access, Contemporary Disability Art and Institutional Critique from 2024, and the editor of Curating Access, Disability Art Activism and Creative Accommodation from 2022, which includes over 40 international contributors. She has a PhD in art theory, history, and criticism from the University of California, San Diego, and has curated approximately 50 exhibitions, many of which have traveled to cities across the USA, England, Australia, and Canada. And Syrus is a Vanier scholar, visual artist, activist, curator, and educator. Using painting, installation, and performance, Syrus works with and explores social justice frameworks and Black activist culture. Syrus's work has been shown widely, including solo shows at the Grunt Gallery in 2018 with 2068 Touch Change and Willa Ball art projects in 2021 with Irresistible Revolutions. Syrus's work has been featured as part of the inaugural Toronto Biennale of Art in 2019 in conjunction with the TNU Image Center with Antarctica and Ancestors, Do You Read Us? Dispatches from the Future, as well as for the Bentways Safety in Public Spaces initiative in 2020 with Radical Love. Syrus has participated in group shows at the Never Apart in Montreal, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the University of Lethbridge Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of York University, the Art Gallery of Windsor, and as part of the curated content at Nuit Blanche 2017. His performance works have been part of festivals across Canada, including at Cripping the Stage, Harbour Front Centre 2016 and 2019, Complex Social Change at the University of Lethbridge Art Gallery in 2015, and Decolonizing and Decriminalizing Trans Genres at the University of Winnipeg in 2015. So thank you both very much for being here and joining us today. And I'm going to pass it back over to Heather.
Thanks, Joanne. So today's conversation addresses disability, art activism, and institutional critiques. Our conversation will address approaches to accessibility, access as a methodology, disabled futures, decolonization, institutional critique, and social justice. So our format is structured to feature the experiences and the ideas of our speakers. We prepared some questions for them to respond to, and we'll also hold space for audience engagement. We will be adding comments and information periodically within the chat. As you've seen, we've already got a couple of links to the previous talks that we've had. If you have questions, our chat seems to be dysfunctional at the moment. So we're going to need to run things through the Q&A portal. So if you do have questions that you'd like for the panelists to consider as we go through the conversation, please add those into the Q&A forum. And yes, on that note, I will pass it back to Sarah to get us started.
Yes, to get us finally started, we wanted to invite both of our speakers to locate themselves and their research. So, how do they do their work in the world? So, my first question goes to Amanda. You're working as a curator, a scholar. How do you understand accessibility in your practice? And I'm wondering how your curatorial projects and relationships with artists and institutions inform your approach to accessibility.
Great, thank you for that question. Before I dig into the response to that, I just want to acknowledge everyone here today. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the generous and kind invitation. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Syrus, who I've admired for a long time, and we've worked collaboratively together before. So it's nice to be here with a friend and colleague. Also, to give a self description, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a short statured white woman with brown curly hair. I have brown eyes and I'm wearing black framed glasses today. I have a gray shirt and a white jacket on, and I'm sitting in my home office, which is based in Houston, in Texas. And behind me, I have like a printer and a little lamp, and there's an artwork on the wall, and surrounded by books, which is always a cozy feeling to be surrounded by my friends, which I call books. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. In terms of situating myself, I mean, accessibility for me is like part of, I call it, creative access, this concept of accessibility. And it for me is just like this unending potential for creativity when I think of access. And it just, really excites me. And obviously, it's captured my imagination now for over 10 years since I started doing this work back in 2010, I believe, is when I really started thinking about this and like dedicating my curatorial practice and my scholarly practice to issues of disability. And so people often ask me like, oh, how do we possibly, provide access for everyone? And the answer is always, well, you can't, because access is like this evolving medium that can change day to day. And it needs to be fluid, and it needs to be open to criticism and open to inquiry and open to new forms. So that's what I find so exciting and generative about it. And then, to think about my curatorial work and how it informs my relationships with artists. I mean, it's really the artists that inform me, and I learn from them. That's what I like so much about being a curator, is that I get to work with these brilliant artists like Syrus, who educate me and open my mind to new ideas and new possibilities. So it's really been a privilege and a pleasure for these 10 years to work on all these exhibitions with these brilliant artists. And I also feel like it's an honor to be able to advocate for them and to advocate for the disability arts movement at large, which is still, I think that there's been a lot of progress that's been made since the movement really became formed, I guess, in the 80s and the 90s. But I would argue, and I'd be curious to hear what Syrus says, but I feel like it's only maybe in the last 5 years or so that it's suddenly just like exploded in ways that are exponential and really incredible. I think a lot of that has to do with the pandemic, actually, but we can pause that thought and kind of circle back to it. So that'll kick us off, but I'll be interested to hear what Syrus says next. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about access to as this evolving thing that isn't static and is kind of has to be thought of as a process that's changing. And Syrus, you also have a multifaceted practice working as an artist, activist, and a scholar. Can you tell us about your approach to accessibility and speak to how you navigate these overlapping roles in your work?
Absolutely. And I first would just start off by saying thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel. And Amanda, I'm thrilled that we're getting to be in conversation today. And I just love what you're doing as a curator, and the chance to have been able to collaborate over the years has been, real highlights for me. So I'm really thankful for the chance to dig into a conversation with you today. I'll just start with a visual description. I'm a Black trans disabled man. I have medium brown skin, and long blonde and pink and blue dreadlocks that are sort of pinned back at this point. So you kind of looks like I have short hair, short blonde hair, but I actually have really long hair. I have blue glasses with pink flowers on them, and I'm wearing a white and blue, navy blue polka dot shirt and a moose hide skin vest. And I'm sitting in my office at McMaster University, and my background is currently blurred. Um, and I'm sitting here at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, which is this area that is also covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. It's territory that has been contested and is still actively contested. So where I am is very close to an area called the Haldeman Track, which is an area that's been contested by many Indigenous communities who have been living in that area. And now there's settlers who are trying to build and expand a condo development there. And so they've set up an activist site called 1492 Land Back Lane, which has been doing incredible activism since at least 2016, if not earlier, really fighting for land back in this area. So when I'm teaching and when I'm working here in the Hamilton area, thinking about sort of the historical significance of this place, but also the contemporary activism that is happening right now around Indigenous resurgence in these territories. I am so thankful to be an artist and a sometimes curator and a scholar and an activist who gets to make work with other disabled, deaf, and mad folks. That is fundamentally my commitment to access. My approach to access is how do I do this in a way that allows me to work with more disabled, deaf, and mad folks, because it makes the work better, more interesting, more compelling. I'm happier. Everyone's like, it's just such a good experience. In 2008, I wrote a paper called How Disability Studies Stays White and What Kind of White It Stays, which was really looking at the ways that disability needed to shift. Some of the work that was happening around disability needed to shift away from access for white disabled folks to something a bit more integrated into racial justice, queer and trans justice, and that rooted into what eventually we came to know as disability justice, So my approach in my work around access has largely been trying to get us to root into a disability justice that thinks about everything, that thinks about abolition, that thinks about climate, that thinks about Black Lives Mattering, that thinks about Indigenous resurgence through a lens of making sure that disabled, deaf, and mad folks from those communities are really thriving. How do we create a future world where access is ubiquitous, where everyone is anticipated and planned for? Everyone is expected in any situation, building, place, or experience. So my approach to access has been very future centered and very rooted in activism. How do we make a future world where disabled, deaf, and mad kids have a beautiful vision of a future where they get to live long enough to become elders and where they have everything that they need? So yeah, that looks like changing the way that we make theater, changing the way that we make art so that more bodies and more minds can participate and engage. And it means, structurally affecting the social structures in our world that are creating separation between disabled and non-disabled folks, and making some of us be able to access things and others of us not. Yeah, so that would be what I would say is my approach, and that stretches through all of the ways that I work.
Iris, thank you for that. I
One more
love how
thing.
we're Oh,
I'm
sorry,
so
sorry,
sorry,
go
one more
ahead.
thing. My name, I actually have a sign name. It's an S like this because I'm a twin. So my sign name is, thank you.
Oh, it's beautiful. I love it. I love how we're already seeing a theme of this idea that access is not stationary, that accessibility is not one thing, which, sorry, cat, uh, brings me to something for Amanda and your recent work, The Agency of Access, Contemporary Disability Art and Institutional Critique. In this book, you advance the idea of access as a methodology. And I was just like really jazzed by this idea. That is, foregrounding access can be a strategy for embodied multisensorial approach to curating. Can you tell us about this idea of access as a methodology, how it works and what it enables, and how have you deployed this method in your curatorial practice and seen it mobilized by arts and culture workers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, again, back to a decade ago, I remember attending this really brilliant disability arts kind of 2 or 3 day like conference workshop. And there were some like really brilliant scholars and disabled artists there. And they're the ones that really pushed forward this idea of creative access, and that access can be used to really frame an exhibition and a curatorial practice. And so I really took that on in a serious way. So instead of a practice as a curator that I was more familiar with, which was just, you know, to simply engage with artists, visit their studios, get the work hung, and then write, you know, the label copy for all of the works. It was also about having a conversation with those artists to think about access. So how can they embed, you know, image descriptions and alt text and captions and considerations about maybe ramps to access the work if the work was hung up too high on the wall. So how that can be incorporated both into the physical components of display, but also how artists can actually engage with that as a conceptual material as well. And so I found like integrating that to get those two components together is what I coined, you know, this idea of creative access. And I was really excited by that. And that's, you know, the book that just came out in December. But there's also an edited volume that came out back in 2022. And there's over 40 contributors to that volume, because I really also wanted to foreground the fact that there's actually a lot of practitioners now that are doing this work. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so there's actually a lot of folks who are doing this work. And there's a lot of Canadian contributors in that book. So I'm really proud of that. And so I wanted folks to understand that first, is that there are some really good templates out there by artists and curators and art historians, but mostly practitioners who are you know, developing exhibitions where they really think about diversity and disability first and foremost, instead of adding it on as an afterthought at the end of an exhibition. And I think that's been really the big shift that I've been trying to promote, and some of my peers have been trying to promote as well, is that you need to think about access from the start and really embed that into your planning, including conversations with artists, and where you're fortunate to have. I mean, I've been fortunate to curate shows with artists where I'm commissioning them to make brand new work. And that's always like the dream, is like having them make new work, and where they actually have time to consider access as a methodology, and to think about how can I maybe create a work about alt text or about captions. And there's plenty of examples that I offer in the new book where there are artists who are doing that, like Christine Sun Kim and Carmen Papalia, who's Canadian, who's based in Vancouver, and many, many others.
So I want to turn back to Syrus now with a question to pull us towards thinking about disabled futures and what that means. And, you know, one of the joys of preparing for a conversation like this is engaging with your work. So I had a chance to read something you recently wrote, and you talk about your art practice in terms of providing invited portals to audiences, offering dimensions and times where we are so much freer than we currently are. I was really struck by that. So what I wanted to do is to ask you a bit about that, but also in relation to one of your projects. So that is the 2022 exhibition you did at Tangled, titled Random Access Memory, a Portal to the Multidimensions. So this is a collaboration with your grandmother, Gwen Irons, exploring memory and forgetting. So I wonder, could you start by telling us a bit about this exhibition, and maybe also comment more broadly on how you're mobilizing stories and dreams about disabled futures as a means to engage audiences and critique our current circumstances? So I'm really thinking, like, what does it mean to bring those stories and dreams into institutional spaces?
Thank you so much. And yeah, Random Access Memory was I'm so thankful to have had the opportunity to do that exhibition because it was a collaboration with my grandmother who's turning 99 this year and who has, advanced dementia, and where she was in 2022 is not where she is in 2025. And, I'm really thankful that we got to have that conversation and we did audio recording and we, made this, uh, mini book of her stories. So I'm really thankful for the chance to have done that exhibition. The exhibition was rooted in this idea: what if we existed everywhere? What if disabled, deaf, and mad folks existed in the multiverse? Like, if there is life on other planets or in other dimensions, what if it was Crip life? What if it was disabled, deaf, and mad life? What if what we centered and we imagined meeting people from other dimensions? What if it was Crips who were coming to connect with us, to connect with other Crips? So that was the idea. So there was this imagined portal that you could go through when you entered into the gallery that took you into a transitional space where you could be in contact with these multidimensional beings who were all us. Disabled, deaf, and mad folks, fat folks, BIPOC folks, queer and trans folks who, stretched across the gallery walls in these big photographic installations, murals that I had created where these multidimensional beings had, colors coming out of their face and dripping down and huge swaths of multicolored feathers and these unusual outfits. And they came through the traveling of space and time to meet us at Tangled to tell us that we were going to survive this, to tell us that disabled, deaf, and mad folks had always existed, to tell us about the interconnectivity of our communities. And so the rooting of this story was in this idea of mycelial networks and this idea of what if there was like and because I was reading about how mycelium, is in space as well. And what if there was a mycelial network uh, of Kripkin that stretched across all of the universes and that they were able to give us messages. So in the exhibition, you came through this portal, which was sort of like this fringe, and you entered into the space with these multidimensional beings. There was drawing murals that I had made of mushrooms all over the walls, and there was writing on the walls of this story that the multidimensional beings had told us about Rebecca Solnit and mushrooms being the fruiting body of a revolution and how we were going to, survive this. And then there were seeds. There were seeds and soil that you could take up as a multiple and bring home with you and plant to sort of continue that connection with the mycelial network and to build a little bit of disability kinship even in your garden. All of the stories, all of the text was audio described and ASL translated, and it was ASL translated and audio described by people who were dressed up as well as multidimensional beings, so that the access was built in and not an addendum, so that they were characters as well, the ASL interpreters, and they also had unusual makeup and hair and, these very wild setups so that they too were multidimensional beings. And then there was this rooting in this story that my grandmother had written when we were kids about the mouse and the magic mushroom, about, kinship and love and family and safety. And she tells the story with this audio that gets played in the gallery. And we have this conversation about memory and about being connected. And then we made this little zine of the story. And my grandmother, literally, her expression is, my buttons are going to burst off my chest, because she's so proud that the buttons on her shirt are going to burst open. Like, her shoulders were back, her chest was puffed up, and she held up the zine and she was like, I have a published story, and she was so moved by that at 98, 97 at the time, to have been able to share her art in this way. So yeah, it was a really incredible thing, but it really rooted in this practice that I'm trying to do, which is building the accessible components as essential parts of the artwork. Yeah.
And just to follow up a bit on that, like, it's amazing. Yeah, here access is built in as central from a starting point, not an addendum. But I'm also thinking too about your approach to disabled futures. So is there something you might say, just as this is something that seems a bit broader than this one exhibition? I wonder if you might comment on that.
Yeah, I'm so interested in what we hear and what unfortunately the messaging can be is that there isn't much of a future for disabled deaf and mad folks. And that is something that we need to change, to change that the possibility of hope, the possibility of imagining into 2050, 2065, and all of us are here and thriving. That's something that some of us need some help to make that imaginative leap, to believe and see that it's possible to get there. So enter speculative fiction as a way to imagine a future that doesn't yet exist, as a way to practice a future that doesn't yet exist. So disabled, deaf and mad focused speculative fiction, which is something I'm passionate about, is a way to literally write ourselves into the future, to literally write a future where we exist, where our stories are centralized, where things are still happening. And so, going through the portal, random access memory, a portal to multi-dimensions was about multi-dimensional space, but it was also very futuristic. And other works that I've done, Antarctica and for the biennial and other projects that were set in a future time, allowed me to write about a future where disabled, deaf, and mad folks still exist and where we're thriving. And there is something powerful about believing that we are going to make it. Assata Shakur talked a lot about this, that we have to believe that it's possible to win our liberation, we have to believe it's possible that we're going to, survive this, because in believing it, then we can do it. Octavia Butler, disabled speculative fiction writer, she also said humans can do anything if they believe that someone else has already done it once, So if we just practice it through writing it and through speculative fiction and believe that it's doable and that I can do it, we can start to move towards futures where we not only still exist, but where we're thriving.
So going back to Cyrus's comments a little bit earlier about kind of attending to these different social issues and activism in conjunction with accessibility. Amanda, in the introduction to Curating Access, you write that access is a necessary tool in helping to decolonize the museum so that these institutions represent the needs of a diversity of museum visitors and users. How does the history of museums and art galleries as colonial institutions affect accessibility efforts? What legacies of inaccessibility has the colonial structuring of these spaces left, and how can we maybe overcome those legacies?
Very big questions that cannot easily be answered, I don't think. But, I think unfortunately, the legacy and the history of the colonial institution is one that doesn't simply just impact access, right? It impacts all kinds of minority populations that identify with intersexual identity, and it's like a really big challenge and a big issue that museum workers are trying to address, but also artists from like various backgrounds who are interested in like sort of like post-colonial critique, etc. Right. So I would say that contemporary disabled artists are like just sort of contributing to that same conversation in the work that they are trying to do through institutional critique, just as other artists of different backgrounds are interested, whether it's through the lens of gender or race or sexuality or indigeneity, etc. So those legacies of inaccessibility, I think, can be much more broadened to the type of access that I talk about in my scholarship. So, access that maybe affects economics and class and religion and spirituality and power, like all the really big words, right? So it's a really big issue. And I think what I'm trying to say is that I'm arguing for the fact that disability is also has a stake in that, right? Has a stake in being able to dismantle the colonial institution. And it hasn't really been talked about as much, I think. So that just trying to bring disability to the table and say, actually, there's work to be done with access as well that can really help to dismantle those legacies of colonial structuring. And as far as the part of the question that's can this be overcome, certainly through, some of the ideas that I'm offering and then that Syrus is offering in our practices and in our scholarship. But also also for me, I always put the artists center the work of the artists. And so I suggest in my book that institutions can really work with artists beyond just their objects that they're producing. They can actually work with artists as consultants, disabled artists as consultants, and disabled artists, they can actually hire more disabled people to work in the institution as leaders and as curators and to collect their work more prolifically. I think there's signs of that changing, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. I know that some of the projects I've been involved in as an independent curator, those institutions have been proactive about working with local disability. I guess they call them access groups, or groups that are community driven but are providing some kind of feedback to the museum about, here's what we need as disabled community and this is what we want to see being represented in the museum space. So I think that's another way that museums can immediately start to try and address those colonial structures that we've been left with.
Amanda, thank you for that. And I'm loving, given these times, right? We have a lot of systemic and institutional barriers in place, right? Big issues that we as individuals can't necessarily tackle, right? We're not going to fix this, but what are the things that we can do? And so, Syrus, I wanted to connect to you because we're getting to this idea of institutions and these systemic issues. And you're engaged with institutions in various ways, but also seek to advance institutional critique through your art, through activism, through scholarship. What role does institutional critique do you see it having in advancing that accessibility and social justice efforts in artistic practice? And are there examples from your own practice where you felt like institutional critique was successful in advancing accessibility, that we were able to critique the system and we were able to get something addressed? Or conversely, are there instances where institutional critique was limited, right? And how far this approach could take us away from our ableist norms in our society?
Yeah, thank you so much. I definitely, every time I go to do an exhibition, a performance, a theater work, if I'm curating, the institution is changed after the experience, because I'm going to make sure that I'm bringing in the door those who have often been traditionally underrecognized in those spaces. And so the institution right away is having to grapple with the presence of disabled, deaf, and mad folks, or the presence of, an expanded Black community coming in, or whatever. So, I've really, leaned into this idea that it is important to leave somewhere better than you found it. And so I think that when we have these opportunities to engage with institutions, we have to be calling out and calling in and really addressing the ways that the institution is or isn't prepared to meet the needs of the artists that I'm bringing in. And so an example of that is I was working with the National Art Center in Ottawa, and it's a national organization that focuses on performance. And we were doing a project called The Cycle, which was looking at how to change or transform the shape of Canadian theater to make it more space for disabled, deaf, and mad theater practitioners to create work. And we were having this gathering with bringing together 18 or 20 disabled, deaf, and mad artists from across the country to Stratford, to the Stratford Festival. And we were going to, be doing these engagements and roundtables discussions and public engagements. And there was this one, room that we were going to have to do this work in, and it was right outside the theater space. And there was this little raised platform with maybe 3 steps where you had to where everyone did their speechy moments. And And we said, well, is there a way to ramp the platform? Is there a way to ramp the platform? Because we also would like to use this for our speechy moments. And some of the folks who are giving speeches are going to be sitting down and are going to need to be able to roll up onto the platform. And so is there a way to do that? And we pushed and pushed and pushed and really called in and made it that ramp got built because not because we couldn't have figured out a different place to do the speeches or figured out a way around it, but because now, forever and ever, that platform is ramped. So that means that for future participants who are coming in, that isn't even a conversation that they're going to have. And everyone gets to triumphantly go boldly up to the microphone and have their moment, not just people who walk on their feet. So it's like we can continue to push. And then the other example I would say when you talk about what happens when it doesn't always work is that when I was working at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we started a lot of work through what was then called the Diversity Committee to try to get the institution ready for AODA, the Access for Ontarians with Disability Act, which is kind of like our ADA version of ADA, which started in 2011 and was going until 2025 for the implementation. And it was really successful to be able to um, push for institutional change around access with folks in this committee. And it was really, a lot of change happened very quickly. And with staff turnover and changes at the institution, a lot of those changes also disappeared very quickly. So what happens when the institutional critique doesn't lead to structural change, but leads to change led by particular bodies who aren't necessarily the whole spirit of the institution? When those bodies leave or go on to a different job, is that institutional memory disappeared? And also, was this ever rooted into any structural teeth so that it actually is built into the working of the institution? So that's something that I'm often thinking about is how do we do this so that it's not just Band-Aid stick on, but a deep sort of rooting into the structure of the organization and institution. I mean, Chantal Mouffe talked about in her writing from Europe about the institution, she talked about how institutions have always been hotbeds of activism and controversy and change, and that revolutionary change does take place in institutions, despite what we've been told, and that there's always been people pushing back and changing and transforming. And it can be hard to see because institutions often move at very slow paces, and so the change and transformation can seem hard to measure because it's like turning a battleship in an ocean. You have to do it very quickly so that things don't completely capsize, or that's the fear, right? So it can be hard to follow along with the changes, but the institutional the space of the institution as a space where change making can happen is already set up. So we can kind of push more than I think we realize we can for changes to happen, particularly when an institution is already on the precipice of some other kind of change, a renovation project, a new hire, or something else change is already happening. You can push for other changes at that time. So I'm particularly interested in how do we, push for the things that would change the institution structurally and or like I mentioned with the ramped platform so that people going forward will not have to do those fights to try to push for those things. And then I think that in general, constantly kind of bringing that spirit of catalytic change into every space. As I say, every institution ends up transformed just from the nature of us working together because of who I'm bringing in and what we're insisting needs to be the bare minimum available to those practitioners so that they can do their best work.
Syrus, thank you so much for that very fulsome response. And it's both heartening and then just like kind of overwhelming that institutions are institutions, no matter where they exist. Because when you're talking about the AGO and some of the art institutions where it's just like, oh, we've not thought about that before. We're dealing with so much of that in academia, right? Where it's just like, this classroom isn't accessible. Oh, no one's ever asked for that before. I was like, well, this is something we should, be thinking of before things get started, right? Before we go down too far down that path. At this point, we really wanted to open it up to audience questions. So if you have the opportunity or for, to take a question, comment on the work, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we can answer, bring that into the discussion. I'm just going to give it a moment to see if folks have ideas that they wanted to bring forward before we kind of continue talking as we go along. Well, maybe while we're allowing a chance for people to add things into the QA, maybe I would turn it over to Amanda and ask you if kind of that similar question to what I asked Syrus about the institution and this idea of like that institutional critique, but also in ways where it has worked and ways where you've seen, where you've tried to push for change and it hasn't really worked, and in your experience with that.
Yeah, I have some really good examples actually. So my recent exhibition that I curated for the Zimmerle Art Museum at Rutgers University in New Jersey, in which Syrus was a part. Syrus had work in the exhibition. That was pretty cool because I caught up with a curator that's based at the Zimmerle recently. I saw her last month in New York at a conference, and she said to me, "Oh, I've been appointed now as the access, like the main access point person, which means that now she's responsible for the museum to ensure that all the exhibitions are accessible from now on, and they have to think about some of the measures that I encourage them to implement for my show, which they're now doing for all shows." So I thought, great, that's like a real tangible, productive outcome from, kind of what Cyrus was just talking about, like making sure that, they have changed after their experience with me and engaging with me as a curator. So that was a very, encouraging experience. But then I had another exhibition that wasn't so successful, but I learned from it. And that was a exhibition back in 2016 that I curated for a contemporary art space in San Diego in California. And I decided from the outset, like, oh, everything in this exhibition is tactile friendly. So everyone can touch every object in the show. And I think that it was just not enough time to really execute this idea properly because what happened was that, of course, people, once they discovered they could touch everything, they touched everything and they broke a lot of things. And so that was like a poor, I think it's expected in some ways, but I think the institution wasn't ready for that outcome. And so they reacted by doing the complete opposite of what I had hoped, which is that they said, no more touching, no more touching. So they put signs up everywhere and said, no, we can't deal with this because of all the insurance claims and, going to be irate about, damaged work, which some of them were kind of not too happy, obviously, but then others were a little more flexible about it. So I was really disappointed. And so I actually said, as a solution that maybe I could come as a curator into the space and sit with the work and actually have conversations with audiences about tactility and what it means to engage with work. And it was at that point that I realized we really don't have language in museum culture for touching, right? We don't know because we haven't been educated on it and we haven't, developed any kind of discourse or even a practice around touching in museums. So that's like a huge area of opportunity, I think, and growth for museums to really like consider that modality. And it's like an entire chapter of my book that I've really thought we really need more work in this area, which I think is really exciting. So that's, I guess, except it's again going to be the institution that is going to have to be the leader in that, right? That the institution has to recognize, yes, we have all of these, regulations and rules and, we prohibit touching typically. How can we change that? How can we think about issues of conservation and security differently? How can we, move beyond just like the monthly touch tour that they have in some of these larger museums? I'm not familiar with the institutions in Canada, the larger museums in Canada, if they do touch tours, but I know the ones here in the US, like the MoMAs and the Mets and, the bigger museums do that work here. Maybe Cyrus is familiar, like whether the AGO does touch tours and so on, or the National Gallery. yeah, that's good that they do that, but I think that it's like it could be even more, right? So I think that's one of the arguments that scholar Georgina Klieg made early on. Georgina is a blind historian who's written, been really prolific and written quite a few excellent books. For those of you who are not familiar with Georgina's work, but Georgina's critique is, yes, we have touch tours, but they're only offered once a month. Like, why can't we have more of them? And why do the blind folks have to be kind of like segregated away into like the corner of a room to touch like specific objects? Like, why can't there be more like integration throughout the museum? So I think there's definitely a long way to go for institutions to be able to embrace the institutional critique that we're suggesting. I actually had somebody just write a really fantastic review of my book, which I hope will be published, and they were kind enough to share it with me. And they said, Amanda Cachia has written a book that presents quite the challenge for the institution to take up. And I thought, yeah, I guess that's true. And maybe it's utopian. Like maybe it's not entirely achievable. I'm not sure, but I think that, we kind of already talked about this idea of, the colonial legacy that's been left behind and how big a problem that is. So it's the same idea here, but I do think what Syrus said earlier was important, that we do have, the power of the individual is like down to, if we're invited to a space, which I am invited to many museum spaces, then all I can do is leave behind that, legacy of access, right? And thinking about what that means. And I think sometimes it's hard because I come into spaces knowing full well that part of my job as a curator is the pedagogical role, right? Is like the training, like the Access 101. And if that is part and parcel of my work as an activist, then that's fine as well. I'll be interested to see what happens maybe in 10 or 20 years of being invited into these spaces that the museum is more woke to what access actually means. To see that transformation, I think that would be really encouraging.
Makes me think about that Diane Bersato work, Artifacts in My Mouth, where she, did that work where she was actually putting museum artifacts in her mouth. And it was like not an easy process. Like, it was a lot of red tape to get to be able to do that project. But if we can do that, surely, there's a lot more we could be doing for blind and low vision folks to be able to engage with the work. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This idea of rethinking what we've always done, like we have good reasons for why we put things in place, but we need to rethink the benefits and drawbacks. I wanted to get into one of our questions that we have here in the Q&A from David. He says, hi to you both. It is special to see you both together. I'm so grateful to experience the optimism from your discussion, and I try to mirror your optimism and activism. My concern these days is that the lack of funding is so often the excuse for lack of access, and I'm interested in your thoughts around this.
Yeah, it happens so often that we're told that there isn't enough resources, or that this, great, exciting idea is going to cost too much. And I think that that's like an ideological framing that we need to shift away from, to shift towards, yes, there has to be an access line in every single budget. Every single arts budget should have an access line. And we should be thinking about ASL interpretation. We should be thinking about AD, and then building that in. And so, the way that I'm trying to, I guess, address that is that I do a lot of mentorship and coaching with artists who are starting out and who are writing their grants, and getting artists to start to write that into their grants now as emerging artists, so that they're building access in, and they're thinking about collaborators they could work with. Collaborate with Antoine Hunter and, do dance together, but you'll need an ASL interpreter. And so build that into your budget and imagine the amazing work that will come out of that collaboration. So, that's an unfortunate excuse. I mean, it also happens in legislation and in government. I mean, the AODA legislation that I told you about, Access for Ontarians with Disability Act, it had until 2025 because institutions were given the opportunity to say it's too expensive. And if it's too expensive, they got out of having to follow through with the legislation. And I mean, at what point can we just, eventually just all come together and say enough is enough? You have to, there is not an excuse to say, I haven't planned for you to be here, so I didn't budget the money. That's no longer an acceptable excuse in 2025.
Yeah, agree with everything that Cyrus said, and I mean, I've always kind of promoted that as well in my thinking and, activism around, access and curating, is that every curator should build the access budget into the budget from the beginning, right? So set aside a minimum of maybe $1,000 ideally, and then kind of educate people on what the line items should be.
Oh,
I think we're having a bit of technical issues,
yeah,
Amanda. We missed that last bit. If you don't mind repeating it.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. I don't know if you heard anything of what I said in my response. I was just saying that I was wanting to just agree with everything that Cyrus was saying, and that on a kind of a micro level, my own practice as a curator, I've always promoted building in a budget for access as a curator from the beginning, and to have other curators model that, and actually educating people on what things cost, because sometimes institutions don't even know what an ASL interpreter costs, or what it costs to build in image description and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Both very fulsome answers. I want to take our last question quickly from Bree. Hi, Bree. It's good to see you, or hear from you. They say a question to either Amanda or Cyrus about what other methods or strategies they have found effective in their work or activism, either in the form of literal research methodology or methods, theories, or ways that those tools can provide access in other ways.
Very quickly just say there is work to be done to tear down the old ways that are no longer working for us, and to try to make change and address the system as it's currently not serving us. And then there's also work over here where we're just building our own thing, where we're just starting and building and living as if we're already there. And that's another alternative method that we can do. This needs to happen, but also so does this. So we can also fuel our energy into starting to build CRIP collectives, building, communities where we work together, building CRIP and disabled deaf and mad artists into all of the creative, curatorial and creative work that we're doing, and just starting to build our own thing. We can just do that too.
Yeah, something that I didn't get a chance to say earlier because of my unstable internet connection. I apologize, but I just think that this work that we can do on a micro level is even more important. Like, I'm feeling that it's even more important now because of the current government administration in this country, in the United States, which is really it's really depressing, for want of a better word, and it's really demoralizing for me, like on a daily basis, just talking from my personal experience. And so I'm trying to focus on the good work of the activism that I'm trying to do. And it kind of also speaks to that funding question, right? Is like, if institutions are using, the lack of funding as an excuse in their organizations, unfortunately, that is also being mirrored by the administration, right? So that it's also harder for us to push for that. But I really like Cyrus's optimism, and I think that that's important to focus on the small things that we can do as individuals, despite the hardships that we might be experiencing on a national or in an international scale.
I'm just keeping an eye on our time here, and I think that is a perfect note on which to conclude this conversation. I know we still have lots going on in the Q&A, and there's some, just for those of you in London, the Western community, different projects being flagged and listservs, so please pay attention to those. This sparked a lot, and I think this is, important conversation to carry forward, hopefully at other times in other spaces. I really want to thank Amanda, Cyrus, thank you so much for being here and participating. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else has. And I want to thank our audience. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for your comments and questions. And especially to our interpreters, Lori, Christy, thank you very much for being here today. We're looking forward to keeping this series Conversations on Access going. We look forward to continuing to engage. So please feel free to reach out to any of us, myself, Heather, or Juan. And thanks, everybody. Have a great day.